All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome, everybody, to a really cool webinar today. We're calling it Mixing for House of Worship, and today it's going to be a multi-part series. And the first part is going to be talking about streaming. We're going to do kind of an overview of what it takes to be able to provide a mix for a streaming situation. As we all know, most of the churches now are in that position. Some of you are already doing streaming or have been doing streaming, but even now, it's even become more apparent and necessary. So I thought it would be a great idea to do that. And I guess the best thing for me to do is to introduce myself. My name's Chip Allen. I am the training manager for the Yamaha Pro Audio group. And so I brought along a couple friends, really good friends. These are really great guys, and I think you'll agree. And I'm going to bring them up now so you're not just looking at my picture. With us today, we have Ron Cook and Harold Rubens. Welcome, guys.
Hi. How you doing, guys?
All right, Mike Saram, everything's looking good. So I brought these guys along to help me out here and to help you guys understand and to get a better picture of what it takes to do a streaming event mixing audio for House of Worship. So Ron and Harold, either of you can go first. How'd you guys get to this point to where you're doing these types of projects? Give us each of you, give us a little bit of a history, not too long. We only have so much time, but as to how you guys got here.
Go ahead, Ron.
Okay. I always was very musical as a kid, and I can trace the technical. I always, dreamed of being a musician, but that wasn't going to happen. But I can trace the technical side to. I was in 7th grade, and my dad was a librarian, and he took me to New York for a convention he was going to, and I was bored, nothing to do, and I went to the newsstand, and actually still have it. It's the June '85 issue of Keyboard Magazine.
Nice.
I'd never seen it, never seen Keyboard Magazine, and I just got it, and it blew my mind, and that's the long story short, but was always involved in music, started getting involved in some productions in high school, and college, decided to go to school for audio, and worked at a local sound company for a few years out of college with TC Furlong in Chicago, which was amazing. And then I got hired on at Willow Creek and was there for 15 years.
Wow.
So that's the very short story.
Yeah. Very cool. I think like Ron, similar, I got the bug kind of early on. I remember one of my kind of first concert experiences was actually the Michael Jackson Thriller, the Victory Tour, actually, 1984, somewhere around there. I remember going down to after the concert. I remember during the concert, watching the concert, but kind of being drawn to this island of glowing lights in the middle of the crowd. And I was like, after the show, I made my way down there. I didn't know who he was. Now I know that it was a legendary mixer, ML Pro Size, that was mixing the show, but or the tour. But the I don't remember what he said to me or the questions I asked. But what I do know is that he didn't shoo me away as a little young 14-year-old wide-eyed kid.
Right.
And all I know is that next weekend, audio or sound was in my radar. I went to church. Hey, there's a sound person there, and youth group, got involved in youth group there. It made sense to me. I could think early on as a teenager, audio kind of became a thing of an identity thing for me, made sense. I got those early attaboys that I think were very important, and went on to help out at Big Church. There was a couple of artists that were in residence there at the church and helped out there. And so I kind of started started getting my feet wet in that area. And then, man, the artist, one led to another one, another one led to another one, and ended up at a very large church in Houston, Texas. and made some connections there with some bands, and we started touring mid 90s, 94, I think, somewhere in there, and
I remember
we kind of
those
figured
days.
it out. Yeah, I had hair. I think we all had hair,
Yeah.
and we all, just we figured it out as we went along. But like Ron, music was always something I was in band as well, and music, I was always drawn to it. But I think I quite quickly figured out that I was kind of better behind the scenes and not on stage. There was people that were a lot better than me, but it was fortunate that I got to I went to like Ron, I went to a school that taught audio production and studio stuff, and so I started working in that world. So I have some background in that, and man, ended up and got to work with some great artists, Stephen Curtis Chapman, and for many years, I think almost 9 years, just some great opportunities, and but yeah, just fortunate, and always had a heart for church, and making room for that, and helping and coming alongside and equipping, and whether it's people or organizations, So yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell,
Awesome. Yeah. Just like you guys, I was a musician, right? I didn't even think about being an engineer. And then I started doing studio recording and got curious as to what the guy was doing behind the board. And then I was hooked. And, but through the years, once the whole touring thing wasn't a good thing with the family, I went to work at a pro audio dealer, and my pastor at the church I attend, somebody told him I worked at a pro audio dealer. So he asked me to come in and teach. He said, "Hey, can you teach my engineers? I just want to sit in the pew just like everybody else and just have my day of rest, right? No, nothing to do with it." But, God always has his plan. And so I started teaching the engineers, and pretty much everybody left except one. So there I was, being the main engineer, and that's how I got into mixing at my church. And I started out on analog all the way, to where we're at now with all the digital. I'm fortunate enough to be a employee with Yamaha. And so the biggest thing, and this is part of the reason why we're doing this, is I love helping people help themselves. I want, a lot of people think engineers are, people, right? But it seems like the best engineers are the ones that aren't afraid to share their knowledge and to help those that are wanting this knowledge. It's not a magic bullet. It's not some ancient secret that, once you have it, you covet it. And you learn more by teaching, right? At least that's what I find. And just to mention, I should have mentioned this at the front, for those out there, we have a Q&A section there. So in the Teams app. So if you do have any questions for any of us, or suggestions, or for additional content, please put those questions. And I've got a couple of colleagues that are helping me filter through that. So as you post the questions, they'll go through it, make sure it's relevant, or make sure it's not duplicates, and then they'll publish it, and then everybody will see the published questions, and we'll get to them as we go. So don't worry about that. All right, another question, gentlemen, I have for you. I can find my list of questions here, and that is, how is mixing for house of worship different than mixing, as we say, for mainstream? And either of you can jump in at any time.
I would say,
if there's a difference.
Well, yeah, and I would say I think there's probably some other questions beg to be asked as far as, but if you're in reference to just your skill set, I think basic foundations and knowledge of your certain skills, and I don't know that they are different. Maybe there's a little bit of different mixing styles, maybe. Okay. maybe a sonic footprint that you're trying to go for. Maybe you have different parameters to mix within if you're mixing for a congregation and you have some volume limits or and some stringent volume limits or you have some the pastor's wife has wants you to do this whatever. No, I think that there's in any you're always going to be there is always going to be some kind of way of doing things that you need to, and I think probably having an understanding of what that medium is, where if you're mixing for if you're at a club, what kind of a venue you're in, if you're whether it's a church or whether it's a club or whether it's an arena or it's an open field or open air stadium, whatever it might be, there's different challenges that are going to come within that. And so
right.
But I think the skill set of how to approach each one are kind of similar. I would think
Okay.
at least the way I would approach it, I would approach it the same way.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I would agree. For me, it's very much very similar thing. I totally. Am I distorted or is it okay?
A little bit, but I don't know if it's you or if it's extreme.
Sorry, there we go.
Okay.
Yeah, like I most of my church time now is at a church called City First Church in Rockford, Illinois, and that the style I'm mixing there is. And I walked out, did a show in Milwaukee, Irish Fest. I did not do anything different, like level, different relationships to different things. I think the main thing is just reading the room, the congregation, the pastor's needs, the church's needs, knowing, especially if you somebody like me who's walking into a place that I maybe haven't been, is learning about what is the vibe, the style of the church, right, or the band in the club I'm mixing. What are they typically wanting to do? So
good points. Yeah, it's if your church is a more of a rock and roll style of worship, it's going to be a different mix than say a soulful style of worship. So, or if it's an acoustic style of worship versus a more electronic, maybe your church or house of worship may utilize a lot of tracks, right? And versus an entire band. So all of that, those are all factors. So there's not a one size fits all approach when you are looking at all of these different styles of worship. And
yeah.
So that'll take us let's go to our first graphic here. And let's see it so I want to do it this way. See if it works. Hey. All right. So, and we'll make this bigger. So where do we start? So I brought this one up just to start the conversation within your own head. It's not just about it may not be just about continuing to do what you've been doing. And if you are already doing streaming, but it can also be for those that have never even attempted this. So how does this work? Where do I even begin? And so I broke it down into some sections here. So with number one, obviously we're all techs, right? So the first thing is always about the gear, right? It's like, do I need more equipment to make this work? Do I have to buy more equipment is really what the pastor wants to know, right? and that's a good question. And we're going to go through some examples to help you figure that out. Number two, your staff, your volunteers. If I do get additional equipment, will I need additional people to help me run it? Because you can buy all this gear, but it may be too much for just you as a single person. So maybe you need to reconsider the type of gear you need so that you can indeed do it by yourself if you're the only one that can do it. So, does more gear mean more people? sometimes not. And then the third one that I thought was important is your church looking to do a live to stream on the internet? In other words, as you're actually streaming during the actual live event, or are you looking at more of a post-production type of approach where you're basically recording the event, but you're gonna upload it to the internet at a future time for an on-demand type of accessibility where people can go and look at it at any time. Now, having said that, a lot of your live to internet streams provide both. So not only are you streaming, like say during your normal start time on a Sunday or a Saturday, but it will also archive it and leave it up. YouTube TV does this, where you can stream it live, and then after that is over, it will keep it there for people to continue to view later on. So that's one of the things that we like to consider. Then I come to this one, and don't hate me on my graphics here. So understanding.
Actually, I'm praising you, man. Those are,
it takes a lot of time. Templates help, right? You got to find the right template, but then you got to find all the right icons. Which takes the longest. But so I broke it down into 5 sections. Who, what, when, where, and how. And so the who. So who is going to be viewing this stream and listening to this audio? Well, obviously it'll be your existing congregation, but in addition to that, it will also be new visitors, right? So you'll have people that have never stepped into your house of worship, but they want to see what you're about. So this is also a great opportunity to increase your membership by exposing your worship and your message to a broader audience. What and why are they tuning in? Are they there just for the praise and worship? Are they there just for the sermon? Are they there for fellowship, or all three? So these are things that you may need to consider as you are looking at how you're pushing this forward. And then we get to the when. Again, whether this is a streaming live as the event is occurring to the internet, or if you're going to do post-production. And we'll talk more about what that means for those that may not understand what the term post-production means. But whether you're going to do remix it later and post it up on the web for future viewing. Then we get to the where and the how. So where are they listening or watching this event? Are they at home? Are they listening to audio in their car? Or in a lot of cases, bigger churches, they'll have satellite churches. And what they will do is stream from the main campus to these satellite churches in real time to these satellite locations. So this could also be a scenario. Does Willow Creek do that still, or did they do that, Sean?
I believe it was. I think it's still on a taped.
Okay.
Usually the satellites have the message, and it's typically only the message.
Right.
And it's a week later.
Right. Okay, got you.
At the satellite sites.
I got you. And then the how, so how are they listening to it? Is it on their home stereo system or surround system? Is it through their computer, or maybe they're watching it on the TV through a sound bar instead of a sound system? I think most people have sound bars anymore. You don't see the big, huge stereo systems anymore. Or are they listening on personal devices? So their smartphones or tablets, iPads, Android tablets, whatever. And also, when it comes to those satellite locations, are they listening to it through an actual PA at that satellite location? So some churches that have these satellite locations will either do one or two things, or both. They may stream the praise and worship, and then have local ministers preach in those satellite locations, or it might be the opposite, where they have local praise and worship, and then only the sermon is streamed to all these satellite sections. So it just depends on what they like to do. And so I just want to throw that just to, your heads are already clouded up with stuff. And so I just want to give you even more stuff to worry about, for lack of a better thing. All right. Now we've got all that. Yes, go ahead. Anything
no,
to
no, it's not so much an ad. I would say that I think when you, on that first slide, when you're asking the question, where do I start with all these different things? I think that actually begs another question in that, where am I going? What's the purpose of, what? I think there's some things that before we start discussing, what gear you might need, what staff you might need, and trying to say whether my church or my organization is equipped to do this, try to figure out what the intention is and what the purpose of what we want to do, which direction are we heading, and then we can plug in. I'm of the mindset that I think answering the question of gear might be, for me, in the way I think of things, I'd like to put a purpose and a direction beforehand and then see what gear best fits those, as opposed to putting the gear in,
Right.
So answering those questions and personnel and those things, and then using your second slide as to who, what, where, and how to help answer those questions, I think.
So I should have started with that slide first, and then.
No, I think that's all there, but I think as where are we headed with it? What is it that we want to do? What is your, and I think part of this, where you're going is I think it's answering that, trying to figure out what's best for us, what's best for this organization to do. So maybe it's take an inventory of the gear that we have. What do we want to do? And then do we need more gear? Do we need more staff? How, are we equipped to do different things? I think, but yeah, I think you're, again, I applaud you on your graphics.
All right. all fluff, no content. All right, we've got some questions starting to post up, and just so everybody out there in the listening and viewing audience, our guest panelists don't see these questions, so I have to relay them to him. Right now, most of them are technical, so we will get to them. I just want to get through a couple more things just to make sure everybody's kind of up to speed. We don't want to leave anybody behind. So just hang in there. We will get to them. All right. Let's make sure there's nothing here that's actually prevalent to what we are. Yeah, so all of these are technical. Great. Okay, so we just now, the question is, and we kind of answered it a little bit up front. Are there really any differences between mixing for live PA versus mixing for streaming and broadcasting? What are some of the parameters that come into play here? And I just made a quick list here of some things to consider. With live sound, you're mixing obviously through a house PA into an actual room versus streaming, whereas it's basically you're going to need some type of isolation to do a mix. I mean, you could take your house PA mix and send it to broadcast and streaming, but there's going to be some inherent problems in that. And Harold or Ron, you want to jump in as to why that's not maybe, I mean, if that's all you can do, that's what you have to do. But if you have a choice, why wouldn't you want to use your house PA mix?
I would say that, if you're mixing for a room, through a PA, I think that most of the times if you end up making a board mix of that, you're gonna hear volume differences a lot greater in your board mixing than in what it's perceived in the room. And I think that's because we have a wider dynamic range in a PA, whereas when all of a sudden you take that mix and you unless you compress it or unless you do other tricks, probably very common situations where like the band starts playing and this rocking, and all of a sudden the pastor or the podium announcement mic or whatever might come on, the band goes down, and all of a sudden it's like a huge significant volume drop. It's not perceived like that in the live when you're in the room through a PA, but then all of a sudden you listen to your board mix. And so I think those are certain things, you're making adjustments based on what you're hearing from the PA within the room and what challenges maybe acoustically you're getting. Whereas if you're putting on headphones or you're mixing in an isolated room, you're not dealing with that stuff. And so some of your decisions, whether it be dynamics or whether it be EQ or whatever, dealing with feedback, that's another thing, with having a PA on that you might be trying to get around with your EQ and that kind of deal where you wouldn't have to deal with that.
I was going to say, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say too, like lots of times your relationships between your reverbs and the PA are way different than that, what you're hearing in the room versus a direct. Relationships too between, again, the speech mics, but underscoring during speech as well.
Right.
Like can almost be non-existent on the direct feed versus what you're hearing in the room. So there's a lot of different nuances to think about.
All right. Other things that were listed here, and basically the reason for this slide is just to pretty much make sure everybody understands the same issues you have with live sound, you will have or can be an issue or things you need to consider when it comes to streaming. So don't think that it's easier or certain things you can no longer have to pay attention to. If anything, it might even be more so because like with a live performance, one take, any miscues or mistakes, once it's happened, it's gone anyways. You moved on to whatever the next part of the performance is. But with streaming and broadcasting, those are being recorded. And so if you do make a mistake, if you want to fix it, you would have to go into a post-production mode to do that. But if you're mixing live to the internet, then those same one take miscues and mistakes will be there as well. So those are like one of the streams I did for my church. I forgot to turn on my effects when the choir started singing. And so I had to wait until I got to a point where I go, oh, okay, there, unmute the effects. So
another thought that popped up for me too is a big difference to me is mutes versus fades. Live in the room, you can, the pastor walks off, mute his mic.
Right.
On the stream, especially if you're mixing live and that feed's going somewhere, if you're live in front of house desk, I never mute. I fade it out because you're going to hear that transition on the direct feed.
Got it.
Like crazy.
It's so abrupt in the change of the environment. So that makes good stuff. Whoa, I don't want that. Get out of there.
I think one thing when you're in the room, somewhere in the audience, or even as an engineer, you're in the room and you're mixing through a PA. Yes, you have what you're sending to the PA, and if it's set up properly, you would hope that you would get an accurate representation back of what you're sending to the PA. But one thing that you're taking into account is your acoustics. And so what happens is, like Ron's saying, you mute that microphone. There's a little tail that naturally happens in the room just because of the acoustics.
Right.
But that's not the way it sounds in the, when you're listening to your board mix, all of a sudden there's all this, all that ambience that you were hearing also just goes away when that microphone gets turned off, and so that's a thing, that's a challenge in when you, all of a sudden, if you go to doing a direct mix, let's say to a stream where you're not using a house PA, or you're in the studio, or you're doing a separate broadcast mix or something like that, is that, you don't want that mix to sound, you want it to feel try to make it feel like you're in a space, like you're watching a screen, and you got all these different camera angles or whatever you're shooting. The picture looks like you're in a room, and all of a sudden what you're hearing is a very closed. There's no ambience, and so part of the challenge of doing it broadcast or doing it in a stream is to try to recreate or add, that ambience back in and make it feel, like you're in the room. What's represented in the picture.
Right. So I broke it down even more, guys, because I like to break it down, right?
You're just showing off your graphics.
So now what we're looking at is, are there any similarities or differences between live stream to the web versus post-production? And so let's talk about the difference. One of you want to talk about streaming live to the web versus and the other can do post-production. You both can do both. I'll let you guys have it.
Well, obviously there, when you're saying, let me define a little bit live. Let's just say that you want to do, whether it's a Sunday morning that, especially, a lot of us are in a situation right now. I mean, the whole world is a situation where we're, most churches happening, online in some way. And so there's a couple of different mediums and ways of how people are doing that. You got the worship team and the production team that are showing up still Sunday morning, and they're setting up like normal. And then they're here comes the service time, and they've already communicated to their congregation and their audience that, hey, at 10 o'clock in the morning, we're going to go live. And so boom, here comes 10 o'clock in the morning, the feed comes on and you're live and you have to go, and you're basically doing your service and you're mixing absolutely live. It's going out at the same time. That's live. Yep. Then you have ways to do, where you can maybe record it, like maybe, for example, a church that I'm helping out right now, Christ Community in Franklin, Tennessee, that they're like many churches across this country and the world, realized on the first weekend when everything got shut down, that all of a sudden they were like, hey, we'll just have service and we'll just Facebook Live it or whatever, and I think there was more people that everything went down as opposed to actually the ones that succeeded. But what ended up happening was that they quickly realized, oh my gosh, here's what it takes to, they realized what they were capable of, or what they were ready for to do. And so this church, for example, tried to do that, and then they had some difficulties like other churches. And so we consulted with them. I said consulted. They called me. We talked about it, and I said, you know what? You don't have the resources to do graphics live. You don't have the resources to do, the recording live. So let's figure this thing out. And so what we came up with, the best solution for them was to do a pre-record, basically. We come in, we record on Thursday. We try to run the service as is happening live. We do our planning center. We do all that stuff. When we go through it, we set up. We got a 4-camera shoot that we do, and we basically shoot it live. We're recording it live. So basically, video is getting recorded, live as it happens. It's getting switched live. Audio is being multi-tracked, and so then we go into a post-production mode where I can take video and I can take audio, mix the audio, fix things, whatever, and then marry it back to video, and then throw it up on, Saturday sometime, whatever, when we're done with it, right. Slap graphics on it. And then basically we get to control some of the things. Now that's one way. Now there's some churches out there that are very well set up, and they have their teams, and they've been rolling like this, and they got their people and their graphics, already formatted. And so they can go on a drop of a dime, they can produce, a very nice event. But I think for the most, the greater percentage is probably going to be churches that weren't ready for that or aren't set up, because it's a cost, and there's resources that are needed to do that, to be set up like that. And so one way of doing it is just pre-record it, and we'll do the post-production thing. So I think that kind of go back to an earlier slide of what are we trying to do? What's best suited for us, using those first questions that you asked, in those earlier slides of saying, you know, what are our resources? What are we capable of? You know,
Right.
and what's going to help us succeed and communicate the message that we have, you know, at a great quality, at a good quality, you know, that we can be presentable and we can honor that, you know. So anyways, that's why when you say live versus a post-production, what can you do with both of those things, you know?
Ron, what are your experiences?
It's pretty much the same thing. I mean, even, you know, freelancing at City First, the first kind of weekend of the lockdown, we did a live service. They normally have 3 on Sunday morning, and we ended up just doing the 1, and then they rebroadcast that. And then once things got tightened down more, they basically, starting that next week, went to doing post-production. So filming something. My last thing I did with them was let's see, we did it almost a month before Easter. We shot kind of a, you know, worship set for Easter at an offsite location. And then we're all shut down, and, you know, they're in a position where they have people on their team, on staff, that can handle all that.
Right.
So, yeah, it's just, there's the whole different gamut. I mean, even Willow's just doing, for the most part, it's everybody shooting their part at home, and then it's all being compiled. So there's the whole gamut.
Right.
Of.
And I should mention that sometimes, even though you're mixing live to video, it may not be streaming immediately. It may be mixing live to video to be uploaded at a later time, but you will not have any opportunity to go back and fix any mix errors. So that's another, which is what my church, we did do it live at the exact same time, and then we figured out, let's do it, you know, beforehand, make sure everything's controlled. And we're still doing a live mix to video, but I don't have the ability to go back and fix anything. It's what it is what it is. So I just,
your audio right now, so as you're doing the service, you're mixing it live, it's getting captured.
Yes.
And that's what's going to go out later. Gotcha.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Yeah. That's you're absolutely right. That's another way. So that I would, you're right. Sorry.
Oh, no, you're good. I just wanted to, you know, because that's how we're doing it right now. Other things to keep in mind for doing it live versus post-production, and I'll just keep it that simple, is that when you're doing it live, you're kind of limited to whatever effects you have available in your console at that time, right? Versus post-production, where you could actually record multi-track into your computer and then remix it just like you would a regular studio project. And so that gives you more availability, more stuff to play with, more stuff to ruin your mix if you're not careful, right? You don't want to smash everything, and we'll talk about that. And so that's another thing that could be a benefit if you're looking for that. And then the last thing, as always, levels. That's the one thing that can make your mix or ruin your mix. I don't care how good of an engineer you are. If the levels aren't correct and you don't understand what that means, there's nothing you can do to fix it, especially if it's already been recorded. So that brings up the next slide, which everybody's like, oh no, not the levels thing. It's like, oh yes. So before we get to levels, let's talk about auxes and mixes and buses versus your stereo master. And I'm using this as an example. This is a analog console, one of our beloved Yamaha time mixers. And just that everybody understands, because we're getting ready to get into a discussion of more technical. So I just want to make sure everybody is on the same page. I don't know, I'm sure we have a lot of people here that are very experienced, and I'm hoping we have a lot of people here that are not, and so that we can help them as well. So just looking at the this visual here, the sections that are designated with the purple are your aux sends, or we call them mixes because an aux is a mix, or an aux bus. So all of those are interchangeable. It just depends on how you use them. So with an aux mix, it could be a monitor feed, it could be an effects send. It just depends on where you're routing it to that really gives it that definition, but they are all pretty much doing the same thing. Versus your stereo mix, and so you'll have those auxes per channel, right? And you can, each of these knobs, unless you've never seen an analog board before, you've seen these knobs. And so each of these knobs can control how much you're sending from each channel to each aux mix. And that is also controlled where they show up on your outputs here. So you'll have your aux master outputs. And so this is where these parameters will show up on the back of the console. And this is one way to create a mix within a mix. So if you only have one console and you need to create a separate mix for your streaming feed, you can utilize your auxes to do that. So that way, and basically you would do that with your auxes set to pre-fader, and I'll show you what that means. But by having these set to pre-fader, that means whatever levels I set here are not going to be affected by what I do for front of house with the faders here. And with front of house, you're going to send all those to your stereo master bus, which is indicated here. This is your stereo master metering, and they will show up out of your stereo left and right here. So this typically will go to your house PA if you just have one console. So let's look at it in another way. Let's look at it here. And this hopefully will, it's not too daunting here. So here's your inputs from your mixer, and each of those channels is routed down this line here. And from here, I can choose whether my aux sends are pre-fader, which here's your faders here, whether those aux sends are pre-fader or post-fader. The difference meaning, if it's pre-fader, any changes I make here are not affected by these faders. So in this example, aux 1 and 2 are set up as pre-fader. So whatever levels I set here, that's what will appear here. Doesn't matter what I do with the faders here. Now, if we look at post-fader, these two aux sends are set up as post-fader. So they will aux 3 and 4, and they will be affected by what these faders do. And typically what we use post-fader mixes for are for effect sends. Main reason being that if I want to bring a fader down out of a mix, you don't want it to continue to feed the effect. So by setting up your effect sends post-fader, and if you're dealing with an analog board that just says effects, that's a post-fader mix or aux. They just have hardwired it that way. Other consoles, you'll be able to choose whether you want it to be pre or post, but I just want you to get a graphical view of how this works. And then as far as your stereo masters, those just continue on down to hits your stereo master fader, and those show up there. So just to get everybody on board with how, audio 101 and routing. Now on a digital side, it's a little bit different because you've got more flexibility. But I just want to show you where you find the same thing. So when you're looking at your console, your sends are going to be in a selected channel section. And so basically how this works is you can select a channel, and then this selected channel becomes the controls just for that particular channel. But the same, it works the same here as it does with analog. Any changes I make here, I can choose whether these sends are pre or post, and then they will show up where I want to assign them. Now, the beautiful thing with digital is these outputs have we call them omni-outs, basically because it depends on what you want to route to them. So if you want to be an aux in, you can make it be an aux in. If you want to be stereo left and right, you can patch those instead. So the choice is totally up to you. So if I want my master fader to appear on outputs, I can assign them. And that's also true if you're utilizing stage boxes. You can assign those auxes in your stereo left, right as you desire. The third thing that adds something new here is this Dante module here. So a lot of the consoles now have the ability to network over digital, and by networking, we're talking about audio networking. And so this Dante module gives you the ability to do up to 64 channels of in and out that you can also assign auxes as well as your stereo left and right to appear on a network. Now, we're not going to get heavy into that because that's a whole session in itself. So, but if you want to talk more about that, we can definitely create, have additional webinars to get deeper into that. So that's just to give you an idea of the routing side of things. Did I miss anything, guys, or anything you want to jump in on there? Makes sense?
I'm learning how to use my console right now.
Nah, don't even start there. Don't even start. All right, now let's talk about levels and meters. And I know this is a horrible looking screen. It looks like I threw it together, and basically I did. But I think it's, and I'm gonna let Ron and Harold discuss how important and levels are and understanding what the terminology means, and also how to read your meters. So, Ron, Harold, you want to go for it?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Well, no, hey, I think this is a I think this is probably a very, very important screen. I appreciate you putting this together. Yeah, I think this is one of those frontiers, as you know, in the last, as consoles have changed from analog to digital, and then all these different ways of looking at audio levels and all these, you know, lights that are showing up in your console. What does it mean? And when somebody's talking about, you know, when somebody's talking about gain structure, and when somebody's talking about output levels, and now everybody's having to go online and have to deliver some kind of product, and you might be hearing, well, YouTube wants to see this, or the web stream, or whatever, Wirecast, whatever that you're using wants to see a certain level or a certain reference level. How do I know what that is, and what does it mean, and how does that equate to my console, and all these different things? And so I think the first thing is to understand what you're looking at. I'm gonna look over here to the left and look at the meter. So, like, for example, when some of you have consoles that, for example, have an analog meter. So if you're really old school, your meter might look like the top left, where you have 0 there at the kind of 3/4 of the way up on the scale, or you might have if you look below that, and the one to the right from the Yamaha there MG console, you see that 0 is kind of like in the middle area, and on the faders there you kind of see those are an analog scale meter. So basically it's saying, you know, 0 being the target you wanted to kind of stay within around there, but what does that mean compared now to, like, when you get some new modern consoles, when you get some newer consoles, you look at, for example, even to the right half there, you're looking at that where you have 0s, you know, at the very, very top. Basically it goes from, you get where the lights start turning orange here at -18 all the way up to the over side. And so you start looking at a digital scale. Well, when you start seeing all this stuff, you start, you know, that would be a digital scale, a full scale meter. And so you have to understand what that means. Now, they're telling you the same thing. It's just how it's represented on these meters. And so if you look at the chart all the way on the right, for example, there you kind of see kind of where all these scales line up. So for example, let's look at, you're looking at the, like that second line there, analog console dynamic range, or the console, the 2 on the left, kind of more the analog side of things. You see where the yellow is? It's kind of sitting around the 0 mark, +2, +4, depending on what scale your console is using. But you're going to be within a, you know, 4 dB kind of area there. But what does that mean over to the digital scale? Well, depending on where the reference level for your console that you're using is, you're going to be somewhere in the -18 to -24 range. And you can see that there as you follow the yellow highlighted area to the right scales. You see the digital scales there, and where those line up. And so if you're at the analog side of, if you're still on an analog board, or if your even digital board has an analog scale, you're going to try to be around the 0 mark, you know. But what that means, if you're using a console that has a digital scale, that would actually be the -18, -20 area. And that's what that means. And so, and here's how it all works out. So you want to leave headroom for your console. So if you were, I know that you guys don't see my mouse moves or anything like that, but for example, on an analog scale, if you're averaging your level at around 0 or -3, the peaks, you know, your snare hits and your peaks might be shooting over 0, but those are just peaks, but your average of your sound is sitting around 0 to -3, and you want to leave room for that. If you take that same thought of, I want to be around 0 to a digital scale, and let's say you try to shoot 0, you would be in distortion, because 0 in a digital scale is not the same as 0 is in an analog metering. And so you want to be aware of those things. So you want to look down in your console and kind of want to see what scale you're using. The easiest way, like I said, to tell is where the 0 is on that scale. If it's somewhere in the middle or 2/3 of the way up, you're most likely looking at analog metering. That's a quick way to tell. And if you're looking at your meters and you're seeing 0 at the very, very top, and you're seeing like -18, -20 somewhere in the middle, you're probably looking at a digital scale. And so that -18, -20 area is going to be equal to the 0 of an analog scale. So that's a quick, I know it probably took a little longer to explain, but that's a quick kind of way to kind of understand how do you make sense of the different meterings that you have and where you want to be. And so then you can take that information and apply it to now as you start hearing things, as we're trying to deliver a product, you're trying to say, okay, well, YouTube wants to see -14 LUFS, you know, what that means, you know, or an average of -14. Well, what does that mean on my console, and how do I get to that level? And does that -14, if you're on an analog scale, if you're at -14, you would be way under. So anyways, so those are, that's a quick way, and you guys jump in and let me know if I missed something on the way to kind of in between there, or if you got something to add.
No, Ron, question for you. What do you, and I'll bring it back to Ruben as well. What do you normally want to see on your final output as far as metering? Where do you usually go for?
I try to hit in the -12, 14 on the full scale meter, as far as average.
Okay.
Yeah, obviously don't want to be clipping.
Right.
When it comes to the streaming thing, so much, there's a lot of stuff that happens usually in the scenario that I'm in post of what I'm doing. So as long as I'm in a neighborhood, I'm okay.
Okay.
But it is very important to understand whether it's you're posting to YouTube or Facebook, it's completely different. I mean, the levels they want are the same, but what they do to it is different.
Okay.
And so it just educating yourself on, and a lot of that is just going back and watching it live if you can, or even as you're mixing, having a laptop beside you running the actual stream if it's live, to be able to bounce to it just to hear it and see if, you know, that kind of stuff. But it's, yeah.
I think why it's important to understand what this is because if you don't, and you deliver a product that's way too loud, the platform is simply going to turn it down. They're going to look at that minus 14 average, and if you're like way over that, they're actually going to just turn you down to meet their requirements to be in that, you know, to sit there. So if most of your program material is sitting over that minus 14, they're just going to turn you down, right? And if you're way under that,
right,
they're going to use expanders and whatever in their algorithms to turn you up. So now, and you kind of go, well, that's cool. Well, if they take care of it, the problem is that the way they do it is not very desirable. And so you want to have as much control. You want to control it as much as you can. Do that control and do those adjustments yourself. So you get to control what your product sounds like, because you don't want to sound like the old camcorders where your audio, you know, like you hear the ambient kind of go up and then it goes back down because when somebody starts talking, you don't want all that stuff happening. Or I had a call with a buddy that reached out for some help, who he was, you know, was a front of house guy that got thrust into this, and now he was helping out a church. And why do my mixes sound small? You know, I'm trying to get up to close to zero, and I'm trying to get up there. And so what was happening is that he was actually, his mixes, when you put the meters up, if you would put a mix of mine and you would put a mix of his mixes were, the bulk of his mix was actually louder than mine. But when you put them up, so what was happening is that my mixes sounded louder because my average was at where the program wanted to be, but the peaks were kind of happening, and so everything had impacted, you know, it moved. But his, because he had just kind of crushed it all the way to the top, the services basically turned it down. So now now when you go back to ask your question, who's watching and what they want to do, you know, your congregation is watching your service, and then they might click off, and then the service might go to something else, and all of a sudden you're kind of, you know, listening one to the other to another video, and you're quickly like, why does our service sound small? Right. Why does it sound tiny, or why does it sound thin, or why does it sound a lot softer than the, you know, the next one that came on or the one previous? Or why, when you do a comparative, you know, we want to sound like, you know, these guys are doing a great job over here, and then, you know, and so that's why metering and understanding levels all the way from the very beginning, from when the signal comes in to all the way to how do you deliver it, it matters, and it matters a lot. I have a way of thinking when I do talks that I always say, if you get your gain structure correctly from the beginning all the way to the end, I would venture to say that, you know, 75–80% of your mix is there. The rest of it is just coloring. The rest of it is coloring. The rest is effects and ear candy and a balance here and there. But if you get gain structure correctly from input all the way to output and delivery, 80% of your mix is there.
Let me ask you guys one last question in this section here. How do you guys handle the peak metering, like the peak indicators? What does that tell you? What does that mean to you when you see a channel show that?
On an input side or output side?
Input.
Either way. Yeah. Ron, do you want to? I talk a lot.
It was cutting out a little bit. How do I handle the input metering?
Well, the peak, you know, the peak indicators. So like on the analog boards.
Oh, the peak indicator.
Yeah, you'll see the peak indicators. What does that tell you as an engineer on an input?
If it's an analog desk, it could be something cool. But in generally, no. I mean, in all the desks, like I mix on a venue a lot, you know, the older venues, and you can set whether that peak is a 6 dB from clipping or 3 dB from clipping. Like, it's just knowing the gear.
Right.
I typically, like in a CL, do not want to see the peak lights on a channel, because I know if it's, and especially if it's almost at zero on the input, I know all the way down the line my gain structure is off.
Right.
I have to have that fader, the channel fader, pulled way down, and it's already overloading whatever bus it's going to, or the stereo bus it's going. So I try to maintain, like Harold was saying, a great gain structure throughout my whole process on the console.
And
well, if you
Go ahead, Harold.
I'm going to add this, and Ron, you have a beautiful console behind you, that AMIC console. But on those consoles, I mean, I kind of cut my teeth on an AMIC recall, so similar to that one. But the overload light on those consoles, as the same as say like the old the PM4000s and PM5000s, and even the popular XL4s or whatever it might be, those clip lights, are coming on at about +24, +26 when that light comes on, over 0 on an analog scale.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you take that over to a digital scale, you would equate that. So now let's say if clip is +26, imagine you would be at -24, -26, that's where that peak light would be. I'm sorry. If the peak light is at 0, where it starts distorting on a digital scale, and you go -26 below that to get to your reference, you kind of see, I think, Chip, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Yamaha's on a -24 or a 24 dBFUs, right? Is that their dBFs? Is that their scaling on their digital consoles? I think they're -24, aren't they?
I believe so, but don't quote me on that. All I know, all I can tell you is that the clip light engages about 2 to 3 dB before clipping. Okay,
gotcha. So what that tells you is that, in the older days, when you were wanting that headroom, when you're wanting that, on a PM4000, the trick was always run them hot, and bring the master down a little bit. That was like the thing that you did. And so, and I remember on the XL series of that other manufacturer, you'd want those things. I mean, gosh, it was just glorious to just hit them hard, but just to give you a reference of like how loud over 0 that peak was for that light. So when you're looking at a digital scale, you want to go, if that clip light's coming on, yeah, that would make sense. If your clip light, if your overlight on a CL console is coming in at -3, you would be right in there. You'd be in the -20 range, -20, -22, somewhere in there. So yeah, that would make sense. So, but the difference is we kind of like how analog saturates and distorts when it clips. We don't like what digital sounds like when it clips,
Right.
And so you definitely don't want that red light to be coming on the digital side of things.
Right. Now, one of the things that Yamaha does with their metering on their digital consoles is you'll notice the change from green to amber is right at that -18, -20 point. So that is basically letting you know your input signal, as long as it's tickling that the -18, you're right in the same range as 0 on your analog scale. So that is a quick way that we indicator that we give you, just so you know. A lot of, back in the days of 16-bit audio, I remember everybody always said, well, I got to get this as loud as possible to maximize my bits, right? Well, we're in the 24-bit or higher world now. That's not an issue. The main thing, as Harold and Ron have both talked about, is keeping enough room for dynamics, headroom.
Yeah.
Now there might be certain, in other words, you probably don't need a hi-hat running at -6. I'm just going to put that out there. Other people may disagree, but for more dynamic type sources like vocalists, where their volume will change at the drop of a dime, if they're singing at right around -18, -12, and you want to increase that to -6, if they get loud in that mic, it's going to clip. So you're trying to keep room for dynamics. And then the other thing, just keep in mind that we're just talking about one channel. If you've got 32 channels worth of audio, 64 channels worth of audio, all that has to come together to your stereo bus. So if everything is really hot, you may run into some issues of overdriving your stereo master.